Good afternoon, grade 10G. Our topic for today is going to be about the nervous system again, but more specifically, we're going to be focusing on the eye today. Okay, so as you all know, the eye is a sense organ, and the function of the eye is just to see. It's going to help the body to see light. Okay, so this is what's going to help us to see the world around us. All right, so here's an overview of our lesson. First, we'll talk about the function of the eye, which I just did. Uh, then we'll talk about the anatomy of the eye. Now, anatomy, that just means the different parts of something. So in this case, the anatomy of the eye, that's just the different parts of the eye. Next, we'll talk about how the eye works. Then we'll talk about eye disorders and diseases. It's not here, but we'll also be talking about the different lenses, uh, such as concave lens and convex lens. And last but not least, we'll then move on to some questions. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, the eye is a sense organ that helps us to detect light and see images. Okay, so we have light, which is basically a form of energy that we can see. For example, we have light that comes from the sun. We call that sunlight. Whenever this light shines on an object, and then that light goes into our eye is designed to help us to see that object that the light would have just bounced off. Okay, so the way how our eyes works, or the function of our eye, is that it's a sense organ that's going to help us to detect light and see images. Okay, so now we'll talk about the different parts of the eye. By the end of this video, you guys should know all of the different parts of the eye. We'll be talking about 11 different parts that make up the eye. Okay, so the very first part of the eye we're going to be talking about is called the cornea. Okay, so if you could see where this is pointing, this right here is the cornea. It's important for you guys to know how to label the eye. And hopefully you'll be able to do that at the end of the video. Okay, so let's talk more about the cornea. It's basically a clear, or I should say a transparent lining that you find at the front of the eye. So this is what the light is actually going to pass through in order to enter the eye. Okay, so one of the important things to remember about the cornea is that it is transparent. Uh, when something is said to be transparent, that means you can see through it. The opposite of transparent is opaque. Something that's opaque, like this wooden board, for example, you can't see through it. So these two kids here, they could stand behind this opaque object and you won't be able to see them. However, with a transparent object, you can see straight through them. You can see straight through these objects. So that's why you can see the kids on the other side of this transparent glass. So the cornea is transparent. Okay, so here's something that visualizes that. Okay, so let's imagine that this yellow arrow is the light. It is going to pass through this circular object here, which is just basically the cornea. So that's what we mean by transparent. This light has the ability to pass through the cornea. Now, the reason why this is important is because, like I said, the cornea is found at the front of the eye. It's a thin tissue that basically covers the iris and the pupil. Okay, so that the reason why it's important that it's transparent is so that light can actually enter our eye and that our eye can actually detect this light once that light reaches the retina. But we'll talk more about the retina and the upper parts of the eye as we continue on in the PowerPoint. Okay, so the first thing for you guys to remember or to take note of, the cornea is transparent and allows light to enter the eye. Okay, Next, we'll talk about the pupil and the iris. But before we move on to that, take note of where the cornea is. This right here, this is a transparent lining at the front of the eye, and that is going to allow light to enter the eye. So this right here is the cornea. Now, like I said, we'll talk about the pupil and the iris. But before we move on to that, remember I said the cornea is transparent, right? So imagine that you have I guess, a clear or invisible circle right here. This is actually the cornea. It's on top of the iris and the pupil. Okay, the iris is the colored part of your eye. You find that this is basically a part of the eye that gives our eyes different colors, such as blue for some people, brown for others, black for other people. Okay, so the colored part is what you call the iris. Now the cornea is actually sitting on top of this iris here, but you can't see it. And the reason why you can't see the cornea is because, like I said earlier, it's transparent. So it's almost as if it's invisible. It's invisible and it's sitting on top of the cornea. It's sitting on top of the iris. So the cornea is the front part of the eye. It's clear. Now, like I said, the iris is going to be on the inside of the eye. This is the colored part that gives our eye, a color. At the center of this iris, you'll find the pupil. The pupil is basically a hole that's at the center of the eye, and that is going to allow light to enter the eye. Okay, so in order for light to get into the eye, first it's going to pass through the cornea. Then it's going to pass at the center of the iris, which is called the pupil. Okay, so first it goes through the cornea, and then it's going to go into the pupil. All right, so to recap all of that, the color part of the eye is called the iris. Okay, this is what for some people, they may have brown eyes, they may have black eyes, they may have blue eyes, green eyes, etc. That colored part of our eye, we call that an iris. At the center of the eye, you see a little dark hole, and that is the pupil. Okay. Another thing to note about the iris and the pupil is that the iris has the ability to dilate and constrict. All right, so the iris does this in order to control the size of the pupil. And by doing that, the iris is basically controlling how much light enters the eye. Okay, so you'll find that whenever a person goes out into the sunlight, for example, the iris is going to constrict or get smaller. And that's going to make the pupil to appear tiny. Or if someone is in a dark room, the opposite will happen, and the iris will dilate, which basically means it'll get wider. Okay, so the pupil and the iris is found here. Okay, this right here, like I said, the little center of the iris, this little hole here where you see basically nothing, that's that dark spot that you would have found in this picture right here. Okay, so this little empty space here, that's the pupil. And when it comes to the colored part of the eye, number 5 is pointing to that. Okay, so this right here is the iris. This is the part of the eye that would be colored. Now this picture here, this is basically a side view of the eye. Okay, so far we know the cornea is here. Remember I said the cornea is transparent. Light is going to pass through that. That light is going to go through the center of the iris, which is the colored part of the eye, and that light is traveling through the pupil, which is a tiny hole that's at the center of our eye. Okay, so here's a little short video, I guess, that shows the iris dilating and constricting. Okay, remember the pupil is this dark spot here. Okay, remember I said this is an opening in the iris. This is where the light is going, how the light is going to enter the eye. And the pupil is the iris is the colored part of the eye. And like I said, this iris has the ability to dilate, which means widen. and it has the ability to constrict or to get smaller. Okay, so through the iris moving, that is controlling the size of the pupil that's at the center. Okay, so to recap what we talked about so far, the iris is the colored part of the eye. It controls the size of the pupil by dilating or contracting. Okay, so it's very important to remember that the iris is the colored part of the eye. Next, we have the pupil. A pupil, or the pupil, is the hole at the center of the iris that allows light to pass through it. Okay, so it's a hole at the center of the iris. That's the same dark spot right here. This is the pupil, and it is allowing light to pass through it. Okay, so let's imagine that this mouse here was light, okay? First, this light is going to pass through the cornea. Remember, the cornea is transparent, and then it's going to pass through the pupil. The pupil is a opening in the eye that is going, well, in the iris that allows light to pass through it. Okay, so it's basically how the light gets inside of the eye, and like we said, it's dark. Okay. All right, moving on. Now we are going to talk about the lens. The lens is the next part of the eye that we'll be talking about. Okay, so this right here, this little white oval that you see here is the lens. Okay, the function of the lens, or what the lens is a clear oval shaped structure in the eye that focuses light onto the retina. Okay, so the lens is right here, and it's basically going to focus the light that's coming inside of the eye on the retina. The retina is this back part right here, but we'll talk more about that later on. But this is where you will find sensory cells, such as cone cells and rod cells, and that's how we're going to detect the light, and that's gonna send information to the brain. But like I said, we'll talk more about that later on. Right now, we're just focusing on the lens. This is the lens right here, and its job is to focus the light that's coming into the eye onto the back of the eye, which you call the retina. Okay, so the lens is basically similar to, the lens that you would find inside glasses. Remember, people wear glasses to help them to see. Okay, those little clear glass pieces inside the glasses, we call those lens, and they basically help to, I guess, manipulate the light as it passes through it. All right, it's going to help to change the path of the light in order to make us see better. Okay, some people, they need glasses to see. If they don't have on their glasses, everything appears blurry. So they wear a lens so that the lens will basically help to focus that light so that their eye can basically see a better picture. Okay, so the lens inside of our eye is basically doing the same job. It's focusing the light that's entering the eye to the back of the retina. Pay attention to this video here. Okay, so as the light passes through the lens is going to control the shape of that light, or it's going to control the path that that light is traveling, and that helps it to focus it at the back of the eye where you find the retina. So that's going to help us to see these different objects that surround us. So once again, the lens is going to help to focus the light onto the retina. That's what you see in this video right here. Okay, moving on. Now that we talked about the lens and we know what the lens does, it's going to focus the light onto the back of the retina. Now we'll talk about what the retina actually is. Okay, so the retina is this back part of the eye right here. And this is where you find different sensory receptors. Okay, the name of these cells is the cone cell and a rod cell. So a sensory receptor is a special type of cell that detects some type of stimulus. In this case, it's detecting light. Okay, so I'll say that over. The retina is the back part of this eye here, and they have these special type of cells called cone cells and rod cells. This is going to help us to see different colors or to see something that's black or white. Okay, so with the cone cells, these cells help us to see colors. The rod cells, they help us to see black and white. Okay, and you find these cells inside of the retina. Okay, so this is what's going to help us to see the light or the images inside or the images around us as light enter our eye. Okay, so these cells are going to help us to see the different objects around us as the light travels into our eye. Okay, so let's recap what we learned so far. We know that this clear part here, if you can see a little bit closely, this right here is the cornea. Underneath the cornea, you see this colored thing right here, and that's the iris. This little hole to the center here, we know this is the pupil. Okay, remember the pupil allows the light to enter the eye. This little oval here is the lens. We just finished talking about what the lens does. As that light passes through the lens, it's going to focus that light onto the back of the eye where you find these special cells called cone cells and rod cells. So the lens is going to focus this light onto the retina. And once it focuses on the retina has these special type of cells that can see different colors as well as see black and white. Okay, and like I said, their name are the cone cell and the rod cell. Okay, so let's recap what we talked about so far. This right here is called the cornea. At the center of the iris, we have the pupil, which is just a hole at the center of the iris that is going to allow light to enter the eye. Okay, and like I said earlier, number 5, this is the colored part of the eye. We call this the iris. Number 6, we learned that number 6 was the lens. And the lens is going to help to focus this light that's coming into the eye onto the back part of the eye here that we call the retina. The retina have these special cells called cone cells and rod cells that help to detect the different colors that we see from the light that's entering our eye. Okay, so whenever we look around the room, for example, and we see a bunch of different colors, we know that we are seeing these colors because we have cone cells inside of our retina. Whenever we look at something that's dark, or if you're in a dark room, for example, and the lights are off, you can only see basically blackness. All right, so what's gonna help you to see then are your rod cells. The rod cells is gonna help you to see black as well as white, okay? So basically that's what you'll use in a room that has no lights, and when you look around, all you see is basically a dark shadow of whatever object might be inside that room with you. That's because of the rod cells. They help you to see black and white. Okay, next we'll talk about the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor, okay? All right, so if you think of the eye as a little ball, for example, obviously you have to have some type of fluid inside of the eye in order to maintain its shape, okay? So that's what the aqueous humor is and the vitreous humor is, okay? So if you look at this picture here, right? The eye is not hollow. It has a fluid inside of it that's basically clear and transparent. That's going to help to maintain the shape of the eye, okay? So if you could imagine that, I guess the eye had 2 empty spaces or 2 chambers. The first half, you call that the aqueous humor. This is right underneath the cornea. So inside this part of the eye here, you find a clear gel-like material that's basically going to help reflect some of, well, not reflect, but it's going to control the path that the light travels as it enters the eye. So the aqueous humor is just a fluid-like substance that you find inside of this part of the eye here. Now with the vitreous humor, this is a fluid-like substance that you're going to find inside the back of the eye. Okay, so these fluids, they do two things. They help to control the path that the light is traveling as it enters the eye, and it also helps to maintain the shape of the eye. Okay, so that's the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor. The aqueous humor, you find this at the front. Vitreous humor, you find this at the back of the eye. All right, so like I said, inside those parts of the eye, it's basically a clear gel-like material that you find inside this front section of the eye and this back section of the eye here, okay? Like I said, one of the reasons why that's important is because it's going to help to maintain the shape of the eye, okay? So the same way how a basketball, you have to put air inside the basketball to maintain its shape, all right? So that's one of the things the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor is going to do once it's inside the eye. Okay, so it's just a clear-like material substance that you find inside the eye. Okay, so it's a transparent, watery fluid in the front of the eye. That's what the aqueous humor is. The vitreous humor, it's the same thing. Transparent, watery fluid, but this time it's in the back of the eye. So the only difference between these two things is where they're found. Aqueous humor found at the front. Vitreous humor found at the back. All right, so those are two more parts of the eye that we now know. The aqueous humor is found here. Like I said, the front part of the eye. You basically find it behind the cornea, okay? And the vitreous humor, you find it basically on the inner parts of the eye, okay? So it's basically the back part of the eye. And they're going to help maintain the shape of the eye, and it also helps to control the path that light is traveling as it enters the eye. Okay, now we're going to talk about the optic nerve. Okay, so far we talked about all the different parts of the eye that basically is going to help to bring this light into the eye and gives the light something to travel through, okay? Now we already talked about the retina, which is basically this back part of the eye here. And we know they have two special types of cells inside of them called the cone cell and the rod cell. Like I said, these sensory cells or sensory receptors are going to detect light. Okay, so once they detect light, remember receptors are a part of the nervous system. Okay, for example, we have receptors inside our fingers that is going to help us to detect touch or whenever something touches our hand. Okay, so it's the same thing with the cone cell and the rod cells. They're a special type of receptor or sensory receptor that you find inside the eye. Remember that eye is a part of the nervous system. This is a sense organ. It's going to help us to see. Okay, so whenever light enters the eye, the cone cells and the rod cells inside of the retina, they're going to detect this light. Okay, but once you detect the light, remember with the nervous system, a nerve impulse is created, but this nerve impulse is going to have to travel along nerves in order to get to the brain or the spinal cord where that information will be processed. So it's the same thing with, you know, how we, if we were to touch something hard with our hands, that's going to create a nerve impulse inside our hand. That's going to travel into our nerves until it gets to our spinal cord and our brain. And our brain will basically then tell us, you know, we're feeling pain. It's the same thing with the eye. The eye is also a sense organ. It's going to help us to see something. Okay, so once those cone cells and nerve cells detect a stimulus, those nerve impulses are going to be sent along the optic nerve. Okay, and once it goes into the optic nerve, the brain is then going to process this information and it's going to create an image based on the information sent to it from the retina. Okay, so the next part we're talking about here is the optic nerve. This is just basically a long nerve that connects our eyes to our brain, and it's going to be sending information or nerve impulses to our brain. And that's going to help us to see an image. Okay. Now, another interesting thing to remember about the eye is that initially, once this light travels or enters our eye, the initial image that our eye creates or sees is upside down. Okay, so for example, you see this light bulb here, it's right side up. But once this information gets into our eye and passes through the cornea and the lens, that's going to flip this image upside down. So initially the image that we see is upside down, but because all of this information collected by the nerve cells and the rod cells, which have the ability to detect light, it's going to send that information to the brain. Remember, our brain basically is I guess, the command center of our body. This is where this information is going to be processed, and this is when the brain is going to interpret this information to try to make it make sense. Okay, so once this image reaches the brain, then it's going to turn the image right side up again, and that's going to help us to see whatever is around us. Okay, so I'll summarize that. Initially, our eye is going to create an upside down image, and that information is going to be sent to the brain, and the brain is going to turn that it's going to turn that image right side up. Okay, so we learned two things here. We learned that the optic nerve is going to carry nerve impulses from the eye to the brain, and we also learned that the brain is going to interpret this information. Okay, so it's going to create an image of the object that we see. Okay, so if we come back to this image here, number 9 points to the optic nerve. That's this part right here. And it's basically collecting nerve impulses from the retina. And once it gets into the optic nerve is going to send that to our brain, and our brain is going to process that information. Okay, so that covers basically the majority of the different parts of our eye. But now I'll talk about, I guess, some other important parts of the eye as well. Okay. All right. So, or I should say, important features of the eye. Okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is called a blind spot. Okay. So the blind spot is basically a feature of the eye. It's basically a part of the eye that doesn't have cone cells or rod cells. Or another explanation is that the cone cells and rod cells at this part of the retina is basically blocked by the optic nerve. Okay, so this is basically a part of our eye that cannot see anything. Okay, so I don't know if you guys ever heard about the expression of, someone having a blind spot or not being able to see something that's coming to them. For example, if they're in a car and I guess something just catches them by surprise because they didn't see it. Okay, so that's what the blind spot is. And you also have this thing called a blind spot test. Now, I don't know if it'll work on your phone, but you could try it. Basically, if you're on your phone, you're watching this video, if you close your right eye, and if you focus on the cross, if you bring your phone or your laptop, I guess a little bit close to your face, as you're moving it towards you, you will basically see that the dot to the left of it might disappear. Okay, the reason why you can't see the dot is because this is your blind spot. And like I said, this is a part of your eye that can't see because the cone cells and the rod cells are being blocked. Okay, so that's what a blind spot is. All right, next we're going to talk about the sclera. Now the sclera, this is basically the white part of the eye that you can see. It's basically a tough coat that covers the entire eye. So this is what's actually going to, I guess, give the eye its shape. It basically surrounds the entire eye. So this white layer right here, you know, that we all associate with an eye whenever you see it. You know, when you look at an eye, you see two things, or maybe three things. You're gonna see the white part of the eye, you're gonna see a colored part of the eye, you're gonna see a dark part of the eye. The white part of the eye, that's called the sclera. This colored part, as we all know by now, this is the iris, and that dark spot, which is actually a hole, we call that the pupil. Okay, so the sclera is just a tough white coat that covers the entire eye.